بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين سبحان الله بحمده سبحان الله العظيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد ربنا لا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا أو أخطأنا ربنا ولا تحمل علينا إصرا كما حملته على الذين من قبلنا ربنا ولا تحملنا ما لا طاقة لنا به واعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا أنت مولانا فانصرنا على القوم الكافرين ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب ربنا إننا آمنا فاغفر لنا ذنوبنا وقنا عذاب النار ربنا اغفر لنا ذنوبنا وإسرافنا في أمرنا وثبت أقدامنا وانصرنا على القوم الكافرين ربنا آتنا من لدنك رحمة وهيئ لنا من أمرنا رشدا ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار ربنا أفرغ علينا صبرا وثبت أقدامنا وانصرنا على القوم الكافرين ربنا إننا سمعنا مناديا ينادي للإيمان أن آمنوا بربكم فآمنا ربنا فاغفر لنا ذنوبنا وكفر عنا سيئاتنا وتوفنا مع الأبرار ربنا وآتنا ما وعدتنا على رسلك ولا تخزنا يوم القيامة إنك لا تخلف الميعاد ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وأرنا مناسكنا وتب علينا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد وبارك وسلم إنك حميد مجيد.
मैं यहाँ हर अहमदी और हर नए आने वाले और हर नौजवान पर वादे करना चाहता हूँ कि इमामत और खिलाफत और डिक्टेटरशिप में बड़ा फ़र्क है। कौन सा डिक्टेटर है जो अपने मुल्क की रियाया से ज़ाती ताल्लुक़ भी रखता हो? खलीफा वक्त का तो दुनिया में फैले हुए हर कौम और हर नस्ल के अहमदी से ज़ाती ताल्लुक़ है। उनके ज़ाती खतूत आते हैं जिनमें उनके ज़ाती मामलात का जिक्र होता है। इन रोज़ाना के खतूत को ही अगर देखें तो दुनिया वालों के लिए एक ये नाकाबिल यकीन बात है। ये खिलाफत ही है जो दुनिया में रहने वालों, बसने वाले, रहने वाले हर अहमदी की तकलीफ़ पर तवज्जो देती है।
It is hugely reassuring to hear your message of love for all, hatred for none. This mantra is certainly a message well worth spreading.
We open our hearts and give sadaqah to seek a righteous spirit. We recite the God-given book, the guide to life.
Last time I was discussing the commentary made by Maxime Rodinson or Maxime Rodinson, French Jewish author. While I have not yet finished the discussion, the time was over. So I'll take up from where I left. While commenting on the outcome of the battle, he observes, by this time night had fallen. Would the victorious Meccans march on Medina? To the surprise and relief of many, they did not do so, but went away in the direction of Mecca. They had won a great victory. Muhammad's army had been literally decimated. There were about 70 dead, only 10 of them emigrants against a score of Qurayshites. It could therefore be fairly said that vengeance had been taken for the dead of Badr. To embark now on the difficult siege of the labyrinth of forts in Medina, an operation for which the Qurayshites' army was ill prepared, would be to hazard their great success to no purpose. Moreover, it would stir up the whole population of Medina, including the Jews, against them, when they had set out only to fight Muhammad's private army. It would reforge the unity which had been imperiled by that very Meccan victory, which might be expected to strengthen all the messenger's opponents, not only the Jews and pagans, but also the Muslim opposition led by Abdullah ibn Ubay, which had refused to fight outside the bounds of the city. It was wiser not to precipitate the worst by attempting too much, especially since the Meccan army had, after all, its own casualties. Now here, as he has very clearly asserted, a picture is being painted of total decimation of the Muslim army, and the only reason why they are told not to have attacked Medina is that, according to them, it was not the fear of the defeated Muslim army, but the fear of those who had not so far participated in the battle. Those who were left behind in Medina, like Jews, like pagans, with whom a treaty had been signed earlier, that if any enemy attacked Medina, no matter why he did so and which religion he belonged to, all the inhabitants of Medina will jointly defend the city. So as such, he points out that that is the only reason. They were afraid of the Jews, of the pagans, of the munafiqeen, whom he calls Muslims, led by Abdullah bin Ubay. Otherwise, there was no reason whatsoever why they should not have. Now, this view is given a lie by what happened later on. Because Hazrat sallallahu alaihi wasallam pursued the enemy beyond the bounds of Medina, much further away than the field where Battle of Uhud was fought. And that leaves us with no choice but to reject this view that the enemy did not attack Medina for the fear of those who had not fought. So this is a very interesting and a very moving aspect of what followed, and I would read from him and from some others. Then the company of the survivors, according to the same author, emerging from the various crannies in the rocks where they had been hiding, wounded and bleeding, made their way slowly back to Medina, where they were greeted by the shrill cries with which the Arab women are used to mourn the death of their kinfolk. Almost before his wounds were dressed, Muhammad, with his companions, who were scarcely in a better state, set out bravely on the road to Mecca in pursuit of Abu Sufyan's forces. They kept at a distance, lighting big watchfires to signal their presence, in the hope, no doubt, that the Qurayshites would imagine them to be a large army strengthened by reinforcements, and so be deterred from returning to attack Medina, if that had been their intention. Now I'll explain the circumstances which led to this follow-up by Hazrat sallallahu alaihi wasallam and pursuit of the enemy, and the intentions why he did so. They are all very apparent. I have an account written in notes in Urdu, so I'll translate it as I refresh my memory. Hazrat sallallahu alaihi wasallam returned to Medina the same night, immediately after the Battle of Uhud. Immediately in the sense that after he had buried the martyrs and taken care of the wounded, so all of the army by the fall of night returned to Medina. And Ahmad sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself was so seriously wounded, he himself, the author from whom I have quoted, paints the picture of his injuries, which shows that the trauma he had received was very deep and very disabling. From other sources, Muslim sources, we hear that Hazrat Bilal repeatedly reminded him about the Isha prayer, and he would not say, no, I can't come, but still he was running high temperature because of the wounds, and till the dead of the night he could not come out. Then later on, by Putting his hand on the shoulders of some companions, he slowly approached the mosque and led the prayer. In that state, in the morning when the wounds still begin to hurt far more than when they are fresh. When the wounds, after you have slept over the night with your wounds, the wounds begin to smart far more. And the injury goes deeper into your nervous system. That is the time when you can hardly move a limb. It happened that Hazrat Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam in that state came out, led the prayer, and asked Bilal to announce that we are going to pursue the enemy. But the condition is that no one who had not participated in Uhud would be permitted to join me. Those who were wounded, they were permitted, in fact, they were expected to join. The result was that all those who had participated in the Uhud, and a large number among them was very seriously wounded, they accompanied Hazrat Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. There was only one exception, and that I'll tell you who was included in that pursuit, who earlier had not joined the battle at Medina, at Uhud. It was Hazrat Jabir bin Abdullah. You know, you have heard about Hazrat Abdullah so much. He was martyred at the Jang-e-Uhud. There was an argument between him and his son. His son insisted that he should participate. He is young and he can fight better. And Hazrat Jabir insisted, no, you stay behind with your sisters. He had 7 sisters, and they must need someone to take care of them in case the enemy attacks the city. So you remain behind. So under compulsion from his father, he had to stay behind. Hazrat Abdullah was martyred, of course, and that is what he mentioned during the argument earlier, that I want martyrdom and I will not permit you to take my place, and this is my time. So he made a plea to Hazrat and said that in these circumstances I could not participate, and you know that. So please permit me, make an exception in my case. So an exception was made, and Hazrat Jabir bin Abdullah was also permitted to participate in that pursuit of the enemy. About those who participated in this, who went along with Hazrat Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, the sort of army that was, which went in the pursuit of army, I'll give you a few examples. Some were with 9 wounds each, like Hazrat Usaid bin Huzair, Aqba bin Amir. You know, it was a custom with the Arabs to count the wounds, and the seriousness of the case was generally judged by the number of wounds. And they were all quite deep, of course. Some could be fatal by themselves, singly. But there were some who had 10 wounds each, like Hazrat Kharash bin Samma. Some more than 10, but not counted, like Hazrat Ka'b bin Malik. In the case of Hazrat Abdul Rahman bin Auf, his wounds were counted to be 20. That means 20 sharp wounds by sword, or piercing wounds by spears, whatever the nature, but they are just described as wounds. Hazrat Talha bin Ubaidullah also participated again. He is the one whose hand had been paralyzed because he was protecting the face of Hazrat Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam from the attack of arrows, from the volley of arrows directed at him. And he with that hand hanging by his side also joined Hazrat Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. In this, a very interesting thing happened. There were two brothers, both of them were very severely wounded, one less and one a bit more. They had no horse to ride on. They reached very late at night at the appointed place. When Hazrat Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam inquired from them what had prevented them from joining them in the beginning, they said that we had no mount to ride on. So the less injured brother occasionally lifted his brother so that he could also keep him company. This was the sort of army which pursued the enemy. Now what happened then? Why did not the enemy attack? There, all these Orientalists are in a deep dilemma, and they have to contradict something they had said earlier about the Battle of Uhud. They had to build a new story altogether. The question of Medina, the fear of the Jews, the pagans, all dissipates into thin air. Nothing is left. Here is an army very severely wounded and largely disabled, with very few mounts, and ill-equipped, of course, which pursues a much bigger enemy who has shown its mettle in the battlefield and who seems to be returning with the pride of having won a great victory. A great victory which is lauded to the maximum by people like Maxim Rodin, and suddenly, after describing the total decimation of Rasulullah's army, he found himself in a dilemma as to what case should be built for the army of Abu Sufyan not to attack, not Medina this time, but this small army of Hazrat Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, which, as you have read the description, was almost entirely disabled. Hardly there was one among them who was not injured. Here, let's read some of the explanations from Mr. Rodin. First of all, he, like other Christian authors, exaggerates the building of big fires. Of course, they have taken it from some Muslim sources, but the strategy of Hazrat Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was to spread out the fires. And they say because of that, the enemy might have received the impression that large number of those who had not been able to participate in the Battle of Uhud had also joined. That is why the followers, the soldiers with Hazrat Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, the number of soldiers with Hazrat Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam had very much enlarged. Now this is a very stupid proposition which does not hold water at all. Because it was not a question of one night alone. Hazrat Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam remained camped close to the enemy camp for 3 days and 3 nights. And the enemy, according to these sources themselves, was in touch with the Muslim camp, because they confess at an off-guarded moment that Abu Sufyan tried to destroy the morale of the Muslim army by sending his agents to spread rumors about the enemy intending to attack and totally destroy the followers of Muhammad. So such rumors were spread, to no avail. And it could not in any way injure the morale of Prophet's companion. This is what is admitted by these sources themselves. So what happened then? Why Abu Sufyan, knowing that it was only the wounded soldiers who had participated in Jang-e-Uhud, in the Battle of Uhud, and no more from Medina, who were pursuing them, who were at a close distance, and they had a very strong what रिसाले को क्या कहते हैं? रिसाला अंग्रेजी में? हाँ? पान? नहीं, रिसाला जो फौज से troop, yes, just a troop? No, not infantry. Cavalry, that's right. Mounted cavalry. They had a very strong mounted cavalry under the able leadership of Khalid bin Walid. So they have to put excuses for each such possibilities, and they have to admit that after all, the battle was not one-sided, and the enemy had also very deeply suffered. So all that great bragging about the whole army having been decimated and one-sided victory, all of this is being given lie by themselves. And so I'll read from Montgomery Watt, for instance, what he has to say. First of all, Montgomery Watt is closest to the facts from among all the, not all, but many Orientalists. He tries not to be overexcited about it, because he is a more experienced Orientalist, and he knew the difficulty he would face if he over-exaggerated the defeat of Muhammad's companions. He says Quraysh had merely taken a life for a life. That is, if you keep in view their losses at Badr, that is what he means. Whereas they had boasted they would make the Muslims pay several times over. In more general terms, the implication of Uhud was that Muhammad was almost able to hold his own against Quraysh, and that Quraysh were not capable of doing much more than holding their own against Muhammad. What humiliation for the proud merchant princes of Mecca, who recently had thought that they had all Western Arabia under their control. Now, this is not a compliment to Muhammad. This is a very, very agonizing reflection on Abu Sufyan at having failed to attack Medina. When you read Montgomery Watt, a scholar of his caliber would not easily give himself away. But when you read him as a whole, then you know that he deeply hates Islam. He is well trained in that art. And when I explain, I will give you his biodata, then you understand how profoundly he was trained to present Islam in a manner as if he were a friend, and yet to try to injure the faith of Muslims who read his writings and strengthen the hands of the enemies of Islam, but in a very cunning and clever way. Here, the implication is obvious. He is very unhappy with Abu Sufyan. He can't change the history, but he says, woe to you, shame on you. What sort of leader are you? Here you were given a chance to destroy Islam once and forever, and you failed to do it. So why it so happened, he goes on building the case. What humiliation for the proud merchant princes of Mecca, who recently had thought that they had all Western Arabia under their control. Why then, since this was so, did Abu Sufyan withdraw from Medina without pressing home his advantage? He at least must have been aware of the strategic necessity of destroying Muhammad's power. And he apparently knew before he left the battlefield that the claim of Ibn Qamiya to have killed Muhammad was false. So here you can see the agony at the failure of Abu Sufyan to take that vital decision of turning back and destroying, attacking either Medina or destroying the pursuing army of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Then he says, in other words, the Meccans were not in a position to do anything further. They could not, with any hope of success, attack either Muhammad or the strongholds constituting the main settlement of Medina. It is conceivable that they hoped to win over Ibn Ubay by diplomacy and so did not want to attack him. But this is not likely. At the same time, they had been roughly handled. Now, this is not likely. Why not? Because if they had attacked Hazrat Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam in the open, when he had himself presented him and his followers and left them at their so-called mercy, then how could he have offended Abdullah bin Ubay bin Salul? So without building this argument, he briefly rejects this, dismisses this excuse and turns to another. But this is not likely. At the same time, they had been roughly handled by the Muslims. Their infantry had been proved inferior, and the horses to which they owed their success were temporarily out of action. Their morale must now have been low, and their withdrawal tends to confirm the Muslim claim to have been victorious at first. To return home was clearly the wisest course. When you read these accounts, as is obvious, you find the Orientalists in deep mess. At the one hand, they want to exalt and the victory and boast about total decimation of Muhammad's army. On the other hand, they want to find some reason, logical case for the Meccans not either to dare to attack Medina or to dare attack that decimated army itself. So that is the dilemma. And two things they do not want to admit. That after all, this defeat was not that sort of total defeat as they have been claiming. And it was not in fact a defeat at all. The second thing they don't want to admit is the work of Allah, the hand of God in all this. And during no treatment of this case by any Orientalist, you will ever find a comparison in numbers. In fact, the number of Muslims was 1/3 of the total number of the attacking army. So when they say it was tooth for tooth and all were scared, they never mention that the army was overwhelmingly larger, 3 times that of Hazrat Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's companions. So what happened was obviously something which they can't explain. It was Allah's will that prevented them from returning. They were overawed, and also the fact that they had been so severely mauled by the defending Muslims that their wounds were smarting, and they knew what they had suffered at the hands of the Muslims. They also must have known that this apparent defeat at the hands of the Muslims was caused by an accident. It was not the scientific outcome of an uneven battle, because the battle was uneven even at the beginning. And the initial victory of the Muslim forces against the enemy proved that if some other accidents had not taken place, this victory of the Muslims could not have been reversed into an apparent defeat. And the Meccans knew it much better than any Orientalist can ever imagine. They knew all the time that the chaos was created when the Muslims were off guard, when suddenly the passage in the mountains, in the mountain was vacated, and it gave opportunity to Khalid bin Walid to mount an attack on the army when it was not expecting it. So it was the element of surprise, the element of chaos, the element of a very unwise decision by the people who were guarding the passage, etc., which was responsible. So knowing what injury they had inflicted on the Muslims, they knew very well, it was fresh in their minds. Knowing their own injury, they knew that they could not attack with any good any hopeful outcome. So that pursuit of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam proved many things, and that is where a genuine scholar should have concentrated his mind. He should have imagined himself, projected himself into the situation and tried to understand the message clearly and the import of this epoch-making decision of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It was epoch-making, but I'll turn to that later. Number one, not to include others in the Battle of Uhud positively established that full trust Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam had in Allah's help and victory for Islam. He has not a shadow of doubt about it. And that is what he wanted to prove. That we do not need any human help outside what God has already provided us in the form of true believers. And whatever shape they are in, still I know God would help us and would not inflict another defeat, because at this time they had not committed any act of disobedience. Rather, they had showed repentance in a form which has never been shown by any army in the world before. A wounded army like this army was, if it is told by any general to mount another attack, how would that general be treated? How many soldiers would respond to this? People will come out with so many excuses as to their inability even to move a few inches. And they would be, many of them would be right, of course. But here the excuses are, of course, offered, but from a very different direction. People who are told that you are too, Muhammad had made this exception, The announcement was made, except those whose wounds have overwhelmed them and they physically cannot participate. Not a single person offered any excuse. This was an epoch-making decision also in the sense that it created a new history in the history of warfare, a new episode in the history of warfare, something that had never happened before. And secondly, with these wounded people, to hope for survival, not to mention victory, was unthinkable. And to pursue the enemy, and not just to show off by building large fires and spread out fires for one night, but having there encamped there for 3 days and 3 nights. So that shows not only bravery but full trust on Allah, and that is what has been demonstrated. Again, it was a great strategic decision. If Muslims had remained in Medina, having been targeted by the sharp-cutting tongues of Abdullah bin Ubay bin Sulul and his companions, what would have happened if they had remained in the town without pursuing the enemy? Those who mocked and jeered the Muslims, they would have done it with far more ferocity, and many among them might even have thought of renegading and rejecting Islam altogether. But these sources, Rodney himself has to admit that not even Abdullah bin Ubay bin Sulul renegaded. They must have seen some miracle, and that was the miracle. That the very next morning, in that sorry state and that miserable state, the army of Ahmad, the followers, a small band of course, but it's called army anyway, that pursued him and obeyed him to the very letter and spirit and even beyond, and pursued an enemy as if to offer themselves to be slaughtered. And that did not happen. So that enigma which they tried to resolve will always remain unresolved, because they do not feed to the computer the fact of Allah's aid and Allah's decree. What should have happened is obvious. Anybody can see that. But it did not happen. Secondly, it was a message to the tribes all along and around, that you will hear many things about our defeat and so on and so forth, but don't have any false ideas about it. We pursued the enemy, and the enemy dared not attack us while we gave them full opportunity. And we had not received any additional aid at all, so that aid could have deterred the enemy. Now I'll quote from Montgomery Watt again. Because I want to make a comment on one of his observations, very unfair of course. Yes. On the following morning, therefore, he summoned, that is Hazrat Muhammad Rasulullah, according to Montgomery Watt. This passage is taken from Muhammad at Medina by Montgomery Watt, page 28-29. I don't remember the edition, so if there is another edition with different paging, you better look out for that. He says it was normal and On the following morning, therefore, he summoned those who had been with him at Uhud to set out in pursuit of the retreating Meccans. It was the normal and expected thing for an Arab to do when he had been the victim of a raid. Now, how dishonest he is in these remarks. An absolutely false impression is created, which is not at all applicable to this situation. The normal Arab custom, which he is quoting, is quoted to belittle the great decision of Hazrat to pursue the enemy. That custom has nothing whatsoever to do with this situation we are dealing with. You know, even in our country, when some robbers raid a town or a small village, etc., when the word is passed on that we have been attacked, or some troop of robbers came and tried to rob or did rob and fled away with the booty, what happens is then an alarm is raised and people make small posts to pursue the enemy. This is what was the custom of the Arabs. If a tribe was attacked at night and the enemy had run away with the booty, etc., or an attempt was made and then had run away, then all the fresh people of the of this settlement where the tribe had settled, they would naturally start a pursuit of the enemy, like you read in the Western novels. It happened in America, and it still is the custom in India and Pakistan. So to confuse the issue, to belittle the greatness of Muhammad, this so-called expert and friendly expert on Islam, has this small insertion from himself, like it was a normal custom, you know, it always happened. But if you read more honest Orientalists, they would tell you what happened. I quote from G.M. Draycott, and this and the other following observation, which I am going to read, is taken from Chaudhry Muhammad Zafrullah, late Chaudhry Muhammad Zafrullah Khan Sahib's book. He has quoted these sources. So I don't quote from the original, but from Chaudhry Zafrullah Khan Sahib's. What's the name of the book? Muhammad Seal of Prophet, that's right. Yes. G.M. Draycott has observed, Muhammad is the name of his book, page 201, as quoted by Sir Zafrullah Khan, late Zafrullah Khan. Reverses show the temper of heroes, and Muhammad is never more fully revealed than in the first gloomy days after Uhud, when he steadfastly set himself to retrieve what was lost, refusing to acknowledge that his position was impaired, impervious to the whispers that spoke of failure, supreme in his mighty asset of an impregnable faith. This is how an honest historian sees the event, and this is how he interprets that. But then I come to another historian, Bodley, Ronald Victor. He was a colonel in the army and remained before First World War, had also been in Kashmir. He himself writes about writing about his own biography. He says, according to him, he came into contact with Islam before the First World War in Kashmir and was surprised to find that the local inhabitants worshipped the same God as the one of Abraham, Moses, etc. He was an educated person, colonel in the army, but that was the effect of hostile propaganda from the so-called Orientalists against Islam. That up till then he had believed, like many others believe even today, that we worship Prophet Muhammad and that our God is some different God from that of the God of Israel and the Jews and the Christians. After the First World War, he went to live among the Arabs of the Sahara Desert as a nomad in a camel's hair tent. He says, without becoming a Muslim, of course, I felt the spell of this faith which placed the supplicant and his creator face to face on the desert. Further he says, I heard of him, Prophet Muhammad, as a warm-hearted human being who had changed mundane pagan idolaters into profound believers in one God, in the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. He has his critics, of course, for this sympathy for Islam, because it is a genuine sympathy of a simple heart and mind. In an article published in Review Digest 1964, the author seems to be very unhappy with his genuine neutral attitude towards Islam. And when you say neutral, it means it has to be warm and generous, because when you begin to see Islam from a neutral angle, you have to begin to love it as well. Colonel Bodley, as anyone who read his excellent Wind in the Sahara knows, lived for years with the Arabs in the desert, and he's so intensely sympathetic towards them and their great prophet that he sometimes goes much too far in defending the more forbidding aspects of their religion, so on and so forth. So, this is the author with whom his Christian brothers are very unhappy, because he dares speak the truth about the great qualities of Islam and those of Muhammad. In his book, The Messenger, page 179, he writes, Muhammad did not admit defeat. Writing of Uhud and what followed, he says, Muhammad did not admit defeat. Instead of letting his soldiers be fussed over by their womenfolk and give their versions of the fight, he fell them in. He made them, he put them back in the battlefield, in the what do they say? I have another. In the file, battle file, what do they call? I have got something, a very beautiful expression which is just missing. Anyway, forget about it. Anyway, he lined them up all. That is what he fell them into the order of battle. That is what I was thinking of. He was wounded himself. He was stiff. He was tired. He was 56 years old. That is when it happened. But he put his legs across a horse and rode off as if he was pursuing a demoralized and routed enemy. It was masterly strategy, magnificent psychology. Above anything any commander has ever conceived to revive the spirits of a shattered body of men. Neither did he relax or give ground when he arrived in Medina. On the contrary, he adopted a commanding, almost reproving attitude. Now, what according to Mr. Montgomery Watt was the normal custom of the Arab tribes to pursue their enemy in this state is, according to Mr. Bodley, something that had never happened in the history of warfare. This is exactly what it was. Unbelievable. And there is no doubt that Muhammad's potentials and his inherent qualities have nowhere else been displayed with such glory and such glamour as at the time of Uhud and what followed. Now, Maxim Rodinson is, at his best in attacking Islam and trying to belittle the image of Islam and the faith, and he still can't understand why people did not renegade. But he builds the case for them. He builds up the case that they should have renegated, and even the Muslims today, when they see the events through his eyes, should get should have totally been disillusioned with the truth of Islam. So he says, with reference to the views and attitudes of the pagans, the Jews, and the followers of Ibn Ubay, he says, but they were uneasy about accepting certain of his revelations. Why but? Because previously he says that Abdullah bin Ubay bin Sulul and people like him and many others should have rejected Islam and denounced it altogether at what they saw. But it did not happen. It did not happen. Is it a proof of the truth of Islam? Because even at such time of crisis, people stood steadfast. Even the worst of the Muslims, as are described as munafiqeen, they did not dare or did not decide to denounce Islam. Why? This is the question which he is dealing. He said that he did not all right, but at the same time, they were very critical. He says, but they were uneasy about accepting certain of his revelations, arguing over details, pointing unhappily to contradictions in the words from on high, and asking for more explicit text. All this is his imagination. It was not what was happening there. Abdullah bin Ubay bin Sulul was only boasting about his being right in not going out of Medina that far and choosing a battlefield outside Medina. And that is why he returned to Medina with his followers, because according to the Treaty of Medina, the Medinites were not bound to defend Hazrat Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam or his followers. They were only bound to defend Medina. So under that, he took the excuse, despite the fact that he claimed to be a Muslim. But he, along with his around 300 munafiqeen, as we call them, the hypocrites, they returned to Medina. Now, they wanted some of them to have renegated, these Orientalists. And they don't find even a single one who did. That is the puzzle. That is the problem they are facing. And so he builds the story that they did not, but at the same time they were very ferocious. They were very unhappy. They found fault with everything in Islam. They criticized faith, the behavior, the defeat and everything. So that is how he makes himself a bit happier in a situation which otherwise leaves him very unhappy. But they were uneasy about accepting certain of his revelations. All this is a concoction of his mind. The issue at that time was simply this, whether he was right in his decision or not. That is the issue taken up by him with his own son. When he returned home wounded, he mocked at his own son and said, "Look here, this is the result of refusing the advice of a wise man like I am." And the rebuttal was, all that Rasulullah ﷺ did and the followers did and come by was the very best. And we are not the losers, we are the gainers. This he leaves out, of course, from this account. They seem to have hinted at the possibility of Muhammad's manipulating the revelations in his own best interest by elaborating some. It is not known whether they went so far as to suggest that he added to them off his own hat and keeping others to himself. Now this is something he wants to say. He said perhaps they did not go that far, but if I were there, I would have gone that far. And then this is the most biting remark he makes in this. He says, in this description, he says, who had ever heard of a prophet who had heaven on his side being so humiliatingly worsted? That is the comment made by himself, but he attributes this comment, unspoken comment, to the feelings of the Medinites, particularly Muslims, but Jews and others all together, that the census of the opinion was that the Uhud has proved beyond a shadow of doubt that this is a false prophet. What happened to him had never happened to any prophet before in the history of religion. So he says, who had ever heard of a prophet who had heaven on his side being so humiliatingly worsted? Now let me quote from Christian and Jewish sources as to who had ever heard of such prophets and their humiliation at the hands of the enemies. St. Paul, in his letter quoted in Hebrews 2, 32-38, writes, "And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and prophets who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead raised to life again. Others were..." Now, that is the story of those who were victorious among them. Now he turns to the other side of the picture and says, others were tortured and refused to be released so that they might gain a better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, while still others were chained and put in prison. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were put to death by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted and ill-treated. The world was not worthy of them. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains and in caves and holes in the ground. So they were also the prophets who were treated like this according to St. Paul. इसके साथ now I'll quote some of these are the ones I told you to write from the Bible. New Testament? New Testament. Good, yes. Now I turn to Jesus. What happened to him? He was also a prophet of God, and if not a prophet, the Son of God. If things much worse than that happened to Sallam can happen even to the Son of God, then the prophets are small, minor things as compared, of course. Judas, then Judas Iscariot is mentioned. They are the verses of Bible, various verses from the New Testament which I am quoting. Then the men stepped forward, seized Jesus, and arrested him. But I should not go on mentioning the reference because it will break the continuity. Peter denied it again with an oath. I don't know the man. This was one of his trusted disciples. When he came back, he again found them sleeping, while he was asking his disciples to wake and cry to God and to beseech for mercy, and they took it so lightly they went on sleeping. What I want to do is to compare the behavior of those who saw Jesus Christ according to them as a Son of God among them, and the behavior of those whom they think had seen enough evidence that Prophet Muhammad was not a genuine prophet. His behavior, their behavior I have already described. In the pursuit after the Uhud of the enemy, their behavior is so completely described without any flaw that leaves no shadow of doubt that they had seen in Prophet Muhammad something which no man in history had seen in any other man before. Or what happened simply could not have happened. But here, those who spend their almost lifetime or a long time, in the, not lifetime, but a long period of companionship with Jesus Christ and suffered with Him and preached with Him and spread His word. When time of crisis came for Jesus, this was their behavior. They spat in His face and struck Him with their fists. Not the companions, but the enemies. Others slapped Him and said, prophesy to us, Christ, who hit you? Now here, words have been left out. They blindfolded Him. What actually happened was that they blindfolded Jesus Christ and started slapping Him and striking Him, jeering at the same time, O Prophet of God, tell us, through prophecy, who it was who struck you. So this can happen to prophets, you know. According to them, he was a prophet. He claimed to be prophet, yes. They bound Him, led Him away and handed Him over to Pilate, the governor. Matthew. Then He released Barabbas, yes, to them, but he had Jesus flogged and handed Him over to be crucified. They stripped Him and put a scarlet robe on Him and then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on His head and mocked Him. Hail, King of the Jews! They spat on Him. And took the staff and struck Him on the head again and again. Those who passed by hurled insults at Him, shaking their heads. In the same way, the robbers who were crucified with Him also heaped insults on Him. They said, we remember that while He was still alive, I can't understand, I think something is left here. Yes, referring to Jesus Christ, one of the robbers said, we remember that while He was still alive, that deceiver said, the deceitful person, Na'uz Billah, referring to Hazrat Isa alayhi salatu wasalam, 3 days I will rise again. Then Herod and his soldiers ridiculed and mocked Him. Now, I am quoting this with a very heavy heart, of course. Not that our hearts do not bleed when we read this account of Jesus, what happened to Jesus at the hands of His enemies, but more so at the hands of His own followers, His trusted disciples. I'm only doing it to make a comparison with what happened to Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and to turn the mockery on to the critics of Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, like Rodney and like many others, who say that the battle of Uhud proved only the falsehood of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, because what happened to him could not have happened to a true prophet of God. Much worse could happen to a true son of God, who according to his enemies only claimed to be prophet of God. So his case is fit to be presented to both who believe in him as son of God and who believe in him as a claimant to prophethood. And that proves the point that such things happen to Allah's dear ones who offer these sacrifices in the cause of God and suffer so much that ordinary people cannot. And their suffering is not a proof of their falsehood. That suffering is only a proof of their truth and their sincerity and their steadfastness. So I am not quoting this to support their view that these things give light to the claims of prophets who have been so insulted and ill-treated. Quite on the contrary. They are the best proof, the most powerful proofs and evidence of the truth of the claimants, because in suffering they remain steadfast. And they give up their lives for a noble cause. No false man could have done it. So Sallallahu, if anything, was proved to be true even more than ever before at the time of Battle of Uhud. About the earlier prophets, other than Jesus Christ, we read about Jeremiah, but I'll only give you a very brief account of what happened to him. According to the New International Version Study Bible, what happened to Jeremiah, how and when Jeremiah died is not known. Jewish traditions, however, assert that while living in Egypt, he was put to death by being stoned. Altogether, he was imprisoned and ridiculed and persecuted very severely for 19 full years. It's a long account of what happened to Jeremiah. You know about John the Baptist, how he was beheaded at the behest of Herodias. Now there's one thing which I must also mention in passing is that Mr. Rodin is a very imaginative person. When he wants to abuse Sallallahu, he knows no bounds. He goes beyond the limits of facts of history. And there are two points in his description of Uhud which are a very clear violation of the facts of history on which all the rest of the historians are agreed jointly, the enemies and the friends all alike. Number one, he describes Sallallahu as having spent the night of Uhud hidden in various crevices along with his companions. He builds this story from himself, from his own imagination, just to prove that Rasulullah and his companions were so much afraid and scared that they dared not come out on the same day and face the possibility of being routed by the enemy hidden somewhere else. This is totally false. All the historians, even Montgomery Watt, as you read him, have mentioned without any exception that Sallallahu finished with the business on that very day, returned the following night, did not spend the night hidden in the crevices, etc., and went on that expedition that next morning. So that is a piece of his fiction concocted by his imagination. Another thing which he has done in his zeal to prove that Sallallahu was privately encouraging the critics of Ubay bin Abdullah bin Ubay bin Sulul and in egging them on to do things like insulting him in public and being rough with him, has quoted the history in a very distorted way. Well, the style can be forgiven, but he has even said things which have quoted some facts which have no relationship with the event of Uhud, which happened many years afterwards and not at Uhud. So I can't read the full account because of the shortage of time, but I'll give you a brief summary of what he wants to put across. He says that Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam permitted, he uses words like henchman, etc., to publicly insult Abdullah bin Ubay bin Salul. Then he says the matter went too far out of hand. And Abdullah's son was ultimately so infuriated against his own father by the insinuations from Hazrat Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam that he went and challenged him and he wanted to murder him himself. And when things went that far, then Hazrat Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam put an end to it and stopped. This is totally false. That event which he is quoting took place at a very different time, at Ghazwa Bani Mustalaq. Ghazwa Bani Mustalaq happened in 6 Hijri, that is 6th year of immigration to Medina, and Jang-e Uhud took place in the 3rd year. So the event which took place 3 years after, he brings closer and quotes together to build his story, to build the effect he wants to build. So I consulted many books of history. I wanted to find out if he has any support anywhere concerning this event. Some historian might have mentioned it in relation to Jang-e Uhud. The only thing which I could discover was this, that one book of history, let me see, where is that reference? Where have you put the reference? Following? Okay. कहीं भी नहीं लिखा हुआ है। No, I'm not good. What they say about Hazrat Umar Raziyallahu Ta'ala anhu. I had that in my notes. Anyway, I'll tell you this too. It is reported by one historian, a late historian of course, but it is reported by one. He happened to be somewhere in 9th century after Hijrah. He has reported that during the Uhud, when Abdullah bin Ubay bin Salul and many others jeered and mocked Muslims and insulted Islam in general, then Hazrat Umar Raziyallahu Ta'ala anhu got so infuriated that he approached Hazrat Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and sought his permission to murder all of them, whoever dare insult Islam and the Muslims with reference to what happened at Uhud. Now I must say that it is very popular with historians, etc., to attribute such violent tendencies always to Hazrat Umar. You know, whenever you read about such things, Hazrat Umar is the main person who is quoted as the one who pleaded violence, who did this and that, and who was so trigger happy or sword happy that at the slightest excuses, he would suggest to Sallam that such and such people should be murdered immediately. while in the war we don't read much about his killing the enemies. And mainly it is Hazrat Ali, who is quoted by all historians, who killed the infidels in far greater number. Hardly you come across one or two such cases where Hazrat Umar might have killed somebody with his own sword. So all this gives a sort of a shadow of doubt, creates a shadow of doubt about these stories. He seems to have been built into a legendary figure where, like you say, Lana Gunche Mera Qalamdan, that sort of thing. A legendary figure is created to express his non-tolerance at all insults hurled at Islam or enemy or anything done against Islam, to the extent that he immediately suggests a course no other than beheading and no less than that. To my mind, all these are stories. How could Hazrat Umar have done this, asking his permission to kill all of them? But anyway, if it was so, this author, Rodin, seems to have read this book, which is As-Siratul Halabiyya by Ali bin Burhanuddin al-Halabi. That is the author of the book which I mentioned, having been born somewhere in 9th century. So he quotes from him, in fact, but changes the name and confuses the two different issues altogether, welds them together unnecessarily. Necessarily for him, of course. So what happened was, the remaining part he does not mention. Hazrat Umar, according to this story, which I don't believe, no other authentic writer, no other book of hadith has mentioned it, only Halabi has mentioned it. But anyway, if somebody should believe in it, he should quote the whole story and read it to the conclusion. According to this story, when Hazrat Umar approached Hazrat Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam seeking his permission, the answer was, those people whom you want to murder for this insult, do they not claim that God is one? Do they not testify that I am His Prophet? He said, yes. That is what they do. He said, if they do, no Muslim has a right to murder them for anything. What a beautiful answer. Now this answer could have been genuine, because similar answers have been given by Sallallahu in other similar situations. So I don't say this happened, but this might as well have happened, because when in the case of Ghazwa Bani Mustalaq, the son of Abdullah himself approached Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam seeking permission. He refused to give him this permission. So that was very much like Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. But these authors who are, rabid in their hatred of Islam and the founder of Islam, they go on building these stories. So don't ever trust the facts quoted by these authors. You must go to the sources and find out yourself what they have genuinely quoted, what they have invented from themselves, and what important things they have missed. Now, whenever I have tried to do that, I have discovered something which always happens like this. These Orientalists generally quote from the Muslim sources correctly. But they have a particular style and approach. Number one, they would go to the sources, even the weakest, the feeblest, if they are anti-Muslim. I'm sorry, not anti-Muslim. If they in any way contain something which goes against Islam, the sources are Muslim, of course, The events quoted by them are quoted by some people who also happen to be Muslims, but these, as we call them, riwayat or traditions, they are the weakest, mostly found in Waqidi and many other such historians. While the same historian has quoted far more dependable and authentic traditions relating to the same events, which give a completely different and a much more pleasant picture of what actually happened. And they omit that, they forget about that as if it never happened. In fact, a genuine, honest scholar should have presented both sides of the picture and then argued as to why he is adopting this tradition and not that. Secondly, many other traditions which speak of the true reasons why something was done by Muhammad are completely omitted and left out. So they are happiest when some Muslim scholars, by mistake, by simplicity, have said something which goes against Islam and Rasulullah Kareem and then they, exult on that and celebrate that as if they had found a gold mine. So the best thing always is, the safest policy is, when you read something like this, first of all, judge the event by the general nature and your own personal understanding of the character of the person whom they are discussing. As I've said, Hazrat Umar has been made into a legendary violent person. Now, how can it happen that every time it is Umar available immediately for such violent counsels, etc., and he is always handy at such times? That shows that there is a lot of unreliable element about these things. Moreover, the conduct of Muhammad is so well known. From the Qur'an, from the traditions, etc., nobody who understands Muhammad can miss the point that there are things which he cannot have done. There are things which he would most certainly have done. And on this, it is not a question of intuition. It is a question of your understanding of his character through such powerful evidence, irrefutable evidence from the Qur'an and from the tradition, that any solitary thing against this general conduct must always be rejected. That is also the attitude of some genuine, honest Orientalists. They of course quote things which go against Muhammad and his conduct whenever they lay their hands on to them, but genuinely they also mention the facts that this is a source against these, and this is the character of Muhammad which stands high above such insinuations. So scholars like Carlyle have written great tributes in favor of Muhammad, and he has adopted the same style as I was just quoting. But most of them are very dangerous writers. Sometimes they appear to praise Muhammad and give high tributes to him, his leadership, etc., at the same time creating an impression about him which is belied by his general character. So Ahmadis should make studies, deeper and more profound studies into the sources from which these anti-Muslim writers have mainly benefited. And they should, some should devote himself to some author, some to another, and I'm generally proposing a course of action which you should take. To quote, to give you the example how deeply and profoundly they pursue the studies of Islamic history, etc., with the whole intention of attacking Islam. When I read how Montgomery Watt was prepared for this purpose, then you will understand how seriously the enemy takes these things and how persistently they pursue a course of acquiring knowledge which ultimately would be turned against Islam. It is, in view of that, it is imperative for Ahmadi scholars. Ahmadis, whether they are trained in Arabic knowledge or history of Islam or not, they themselves can take it up and start studying, and they can become real, genuine, profound scholars by pursuing these courses privately on their own. There is no difficulty in the way. Only you have to be sensible and you have to be honest. These are the two qualities required by a scholar, and also hardy and painstaking in his pursuits. Then inshallah, a genuine, powerful defender of the truth of Islam would be created from the Ahmadi youth. Very few people among Muslims are doing this at present, and to point out to this fact, I have built all this, the whole introduction to this subject. Professor of Arabic, William Montgomery Watt, and Islamic Studies, University of Edinburgh, 1964-79. Born Ceres, Fife, Scotland, 14 March 1909. Father was a reverend, educated at University of Edinburgh and Oxford, MA First Honours in Classics and also BA and B Lit. He belonged to a Christian family, very devout Christian, professional Christian family. In 1938-39, studied theology at Cuddison College, Oxford, and was ordained deacon in St. Paul's Cathedral, London, in 1939, and priest in 1940. So when you read anything by Montgomery Watt, you're so impressed by the image which has been created of a genuine, great, profound scholar and neutral scholar for that matter, is also a false and hypothetical image. It has nothing to do with realities. He belongs to a very strong, inimical, anti-Islamic family and a priest family. He himself was a priest, although seldom you will hear about him as a priest now mentioned. As a priest now that he is presented as a genuine, neutral scholar. In 1938-39, studied theology, I have read already. Curate, St. Mary, Bolton's, London, 1939-41. Curate, Old St. Paul's, Edinburgh, 1941-43. 1943-46. On the staff of the Anglican bishop in Jerusalem. You have heard of an Urdu saying, Karela Neem Chada. Gourd, which hangs on a tree with very bitter juice, even more bitter than the gourd itself. So, that is what was left out of his training, to stay in Israel for a few years and further polish his qualities. 1943-46. On the staff of the Anglican bishop in Jerusalem as Arabic specialist engaged in research in Islamic subjects. For that he found only the most appropriate place, Jerusalem. Visiting professor Islamic or Arab studies to various foreign universities between 63 to 79. Now it's a completely different garb. Here he emerges as a friend of Islam, goes to great Muslim countries and is very fully patronized by the oil-rich states of Saudi Arabia, etc., as a genuine friend of Islam, scholar and specialist on Islam. So much so that many an Arab prince have been his pupil. And although he is retired, I have heard from reliable sources that still Arab chieftains send their children to be educated in Islam by this great Western scholar. Chairman Associate of British Orientalist 1964-65, Levi della Vida Medal, Los Angeles 1981, a long list of publications almost exclusively on Islamic subjects starting from 1949 to as late as last year, 1991. He is a profuse writer, and his writings on Islam started off his full training in Israel. That should be remembered. The first book came out in 1949, while his training in Israel was done from 46 to 43 to 47. No, 46, yes. 43 to 46. He has written the following, among many works, he has written the following: Free Will and Predestination in Early Islam, 1949. All these books I am mentioning because they are worthy of study, and most different Ahmadi youth and scholars and intellectuals should read these books and mark the points where they know positively that an attack is intended under whatever garb. Then he wrote Muhammad at Mecca in 1953, Muhammad at Medina in 1956, a companion to the Qur'an in 1967, What is Islam in 1968, Early Islam in 1991. Of these I have not been able to read all these books, but some I have read, and I have also ordered the others to be made available. I remember perhaps it was in Muhammad at Mecca that he first revealed his full intentions. And there he clearly confesses that the time for open attack on Islam is gone. That period is over. Now what we should do is, we should be very friendly and nice and very civil in our discussion of Islam, and without antagonizing the Muslim mind, we should do what we should do anyway. So what he's suggesting very clearly, without chewing his words, is that the same wine must be served but in new goblets. We must, as Ahmadis, defend Islam against committed enemies as well as disguised enemies. And when I came to England about 8 years ago, this was the first thing, almost the first thing which I proposed to the Ahmadis to do with reference to Montgomery Watt himself, that you should take up the cudgel. If you did not, nobody else would, but first prepare yourself. Now that is the last thing which I want to say because of the shortage of time. I'm keeping an eye on the watch. The fact is that Ahmadi Muslims who begin to read about these things very quickly begin to believe that they have become scholars. And not only the scholars, but scholars of the very first order, the highest of the top. And they start writing essays. Now, you have to prepare far more profoundly. You must read all about a subject. Choose a subject. Don't try to enlarge your area of research beyond your scope and capacity. Choose a fixed, limited target and then enlarge your studies about that to the fullest. So, in that way, you will be able to genuinely defend the cause of Islam in a scholarly style. Otherwise, if you consider yourself as a scholar having read one or two books about something, you'll always end up in a mockery of yourself. And such articles are constantly being sent to me. Sometimes it is a punishment to read them, They say, you see, we have specially devoted our time to write this in defense of Islam and this and that. Please read it. So out of their sake and the labor they have taken, I have to go through the punishment. But I assure you, this is no way of doing things. You have to become genuine scholars, if not in a wider field, at least in a limited field of your choice. Then read all about it. Go to the history. Find out what was said on this subject thousands of years before. Come to the present time, pursuing the whole line of academic studies on that subject. Then, of course, you will be fit to write on this. Like Mr. Montgomery Watt, having had a long experience of Islamic studies, having won many medals, etc., he still did not start his writing books on Islam until 1949. And his career began, let me see, before 1939. Now, born in 1909, he was already a priest, ordained priest, in 41. And in the meantime, he had studied at Oxford, at other universities, at Edinburgh, etc., and won laurels in pursuit of his studies. And still he did not consider himself fit to write on Islam until he got his final training in Israel and wrote his first book in 1949. So you may not take that long, but please make a profound study of the subject before you ever venture upon writing on defense of Islam. God bless you. If I sound bitter about some of the great Western scholars, I should be pardoned, because it is a punishment to read. Less punishment to read an open enemy than to read about the disguised enemy. So hypocritical, so disgusting and mocking, and mawkish, nauseating to go through that experience. So that style should also be occasionally adopted in defense of Islam, the style of the person who attacks Islam. You can be that discreet and that clever in defense of Islam as he has been in the attack of Islam. Otherwise they'll say, look here, he is some sentimental person. He loses control over his language and sentiments. He's not a scholar. So when you write in rebuttal of some anti-Muslim scholar, I advise you to adopt the same style. Not like me to give way to your sentiments like I am doing now, because sometimes it's not possible to contain yourself when you read about those you love so much. It's impossible to hear the vitriolic attacks on Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's impossible. And there one loses control and one should be forgiven about that.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا كتب عليكم الصيام كما كتب على الذين من قبلكم لعلكم تتقون.
For more information on our broadcast, visit www.mta.tv. The next program on today's schedule is our regular service for Indonesian-speaking viewers.
My dear ones, you have only come to this world for a short while, much of which has already passed. Thus, do not displease your Lord. An earthly government of great might can annihilate you if you displease them. Reflect, how then is it possible for you to escape the wrath of God Almighty? If you are righteous in the eyes of God, none can destroy you, for your Lord Himself shall protect you. The enemy who thirsts for your life will never be able to prevail over you. If not for this protection, no one could guard your life, and you will spend your life in fear of your enemies and be made anxious by all types of affliction, and ultimately your final days will be consumed by grief and anger. God becomes the refuge of those who attach themselves to Him. Therefore, hasten towards Him and forego all forms of opposition to Him. Do not be indolent in fulfilling your obligations towards Him, and do not wrong His servants through your words or deeds. Remain forever fearful of the anger and wrath of the heaven, for this is the only path to salvation.
جب ہمیں اللہ تعالیٰ نے اپنے وعدوں اور آن حضرت صلی اللہ علیہ وسلم کی پیشگوئیوں کے مطابق مسیح موعود کو بھیجا اور ہمیں پھر انہیں ماننے کی توفیق بھی عطا فرمائی، اور پھر آپ کے بعد خلافت کے جاری نظام سے بھی نوازا، ہمیں اس انعام کی قدر کرنی چاہیے اور اس روح کو سمجھنا چاہیے جو خلافت کے نظام میں ہے۔
سیدی مشفقی مرشدی مہرباں، ہم نے بہر خدا تیری
اکثر ہمارے مخالفین کم علمی کی وجہ سے عوام الناس جو ہیں مخالفت کرتے ہیں۔ مولویوں نے ان کے دماغوں میں یہ ڈال دیا ہے کہ مخالفت جو ہے احمدیوں کی، یہ اسلام کی بہت بڑی خدمت ہے۔ آپ نے فرمایا کہ لوگ سمجھتے ہیں کہ اسلام کی حمایت کر رہے ہیں، فرماتے ہیں کہ اور کچھ آسمانی ابتلا بھی تم پر آئیں گے تا تم ہر طرح سے آزمائے جاؤ، سو تم اس وقت سن رکھو کہ تمہارے فتح مند اور غالب ہو جانے کی یہ راہ نہیں کہ تم اپنے خشک منطق سے کام لو یا تمسخر کے مقابلے پر تمسخر کی بات کرو یا گالی کے مقابلے پر گالی دو، کیونکہ اگر تم نے یہی راہیں اختیار کیں تو تمہارے دل سخت ہو جائیں گے اور تم میں صرف باتیں ہی باتیں ہوں گی جن سے خدا تعالیٰ نفرت کرتا ہے اور کراہت کی نظر سے دیکھتا ہے۔ سو تم ایسا نہ کرو کہ اپنے پر دو لعنتیں جمع کر لو، ایک خلقت کی اور دوسری خدا کی بھی۔ بس ہم نے تو اس تعلیم پر عمل کرنا ہے اور اس ہدایت پر چلنا ہے جو حضرت مسیح علیہ السلام نے ہمیں دی ہے۔ ہم نے گالیوں کا جواب نہ گالی سے دینا ہے، نہ فساد کا جواب فساد پیدا کر کے دینا ہے، اور قانون کو اپنے ہاتھ میں لے کر دینا ہے۔
Ramadan Mubarak, Ramadan Kareem, Ramadan Mubarak, Ramadan Kareem, Ramadan.
O ye who believe, fasting is prescribed for you, as it was prescribed for those before you, so that you may become righteous. Fasting, a universal tradition, practiced since ancient times. While common across all Abrahamic faiths, as well as many polytheistic faiths, it is only Islam that prescribes fasting as a principal article of faith. For 30 days a year, hundreds of millions of Muslims forsake food and drink, while seeking the favors of Allah the Almighty through worship. The Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, once stated, "The earlier part of the month was mercy, its middle, remission from sins, and the last portion was remission from fire." Thus, each 10 days, or Ashra, has its own unique virtue. 10 days of mercy, 10 days of forgiveness, and 10 days to seek refuge from hellfire.
Ramadan Mubarak, Ramadan Kareem, Ramadan Mubarak, Ramadan Kareem.
We break our fasts as the sun sets and glorify our Lord, most gracious, ever merciful.
शरीयत जिंदाबाद, अहमदियत 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 जिंदाबाद, जिंदाबाद ओ जिंदाबाद, जिंदा ओ पायंदाबाद, जिंदाबाद ओ जिंदाबाद, जिंदा ओ पायंदाबाद। मिलती नहीं ताकत के करे शुक्रिया इंसान, बंदों पे खुदा रहता है हर दम ही मेहरबान। मिलती नहीं ताकत के करे शुक्रिया इंसान।
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Marhaban ya Ramadan. Pemirsa MTA rahimakumullah dimanapun Anda berada, selamat berjumpa kembali bersama kami dalam program Kajian Ramadan. Pada episode kali ini sama-sama kita akan menyimak pembahasan tafsir Quran Surah Al-Baqarah ayat 156 sampai dengan 158 oleh Maulana Munirul Islam Syahid. Selamat menyaksikan.